morning, everybody, and welcome to the Law and Crime Network. I'm Jesse Weber, and thanks for joining us here where we cover the most interesting live trials and legal stories in the news today. Let's get started with what's on the docket for today. And guilty. Joining me right now for reaction is forensic death investigator from Jacksonville State University, Joseph Scott Morgan. Joseph, good morning to you. I want to start right off the bat. Reaction to the verdict.
Actually, I'm pleased with the verdict. I thought that this insanity defense was rather porous throughout these arguments. I'm not a big fan of someone that of this defense where they try to paint someone where they can kind of flip insanity on and off at will, and this has been tried a number of times. He purposed to do this, Jesse, and this is a horrible way that Phoebe died, and that needs to be kept in the forefront of our minds. And it would seem that many times lawyers and the media many times try to paint, the more egregious the crime, the more likelihood that someone has to be quote unquote insane. And I think that's a false argument.
I can imagine this was a difficult decision for the jury wrestling with this question. And I have to tell you, Joseph, it was a pretty close case for me. I wasn't sure which way they were going to go. And I think what we should do is let's recap this trial. Let's start from the beginning and we'll go to the end and we'll see exactly what happened. Let's begin right now with the prosecution's opening statement from the very beginning of the Jonchuck trial. Joseph, that moment was one of the strangest parts of this whole ordeal. The idea that he would make this comment, "You have no free will," and then proceed to throw his daughter off the bridge in front of a police officer. There was a lot of ways you could interpret that. How did you interpret it?
It's hard to say how in the world this man comes to this point. I feel for the officer in this particular case because this fellow he's very lucky to still be drawing breath. As soon as he reaches into the back of that car, there's a high probability he's going to be shot. It was just that split second
Right.
that I'm sure that he saw Phoebe.
Yeah, and that's a really good point, and it's just a bizarre thing. But the prosecution, this is just step one. Let's keep going on with their opening statement where they talk more about what Jonchuck did. Take a look. What an absolutely horrible event this was. And Joseph, as we listen to it, I just have a question. Did this young girl have any chance of survival once she was thrown off that bridge?
Yeah, let's keep in mind, Jesse, that it was particularly cold.
Right.
Unseasonably cold at that point in time. Water temperature would have been very low, and also the environmental temperature would have been low. Now, we're talking about a 60-foot drop, Jesse. When an individual that is unaware is dropped into water, particularly, in a case of this little girl, she's flailing. It's a very dynamic event, and so when you strike, even a water surface at 60 feet like that, it's like slamming into concrete. I would think that she would not be able, even if she had, what are the odds that she could swim to safety at that point? Very, very dangerous situation, and of course it turned out to be fatal.
It absolutely did, and we're going to have an opportunity to hear more from the medical examiner a little bit later on. And Joseph, I can't wait to hear your perspective on that. This is what the whole case was about. This is what made it so unique, the insanity defense. Yes, we've seen it in other trials before, but this one, I got to say, it was a pretty close call. Let's just talk about what the insanity law is in Florida. You would have to show some mental disease, some mental defect of some kind. And because of that mental illness, the defendant either didn't know what he was doing or the consequences here. He would not know that he was throwing his daughter off the bridge or didn't know that he'd actually be killing her. Or even if he knew what he was doing, he didn't know that was wrong. And that prong really came under discussion in this case, right from something we heard from the prosecution's opening statement. Why would this guy drive his car erratically and try to evade police if he didn't think he did anything wrong? And that becomes a big issue of discussion, and this insanity defense was dissected by expert after expert. We even saw an expert testify on the part of the prosecution who said, in her opinion, Jonchuck was making up all of the symptoms of mental illness, and in fact, he was not insane. When he killed his daughter, he knew what he was doing. It was a deliberate action, and that is something we're going to have a chance to talk about in a little bit. Joseph, so let's just break this down with the insanity defense. Let's assume he suffered from mental illness. Let's go to the next two prongs. Either he didn't know what he was doing or its consequences, or he didn't know what he was doing was wrong. Which do you think the defense had a stronger case for? To say that he really didn't even know the act of what he was doing, throwing his daughter off the bridge, or he just didn't know that that was wrong, that it was illegal? What do you think their strongest argument was?
But it doesn't, in my mind at least, it doesn't marry up with his actions preceding the event or following the event. I've been teaching, at university for a long time now, Jesse, and one of the things that I teach undergraduates is very basic criminal law relative to the insanity defense, and you have to have a guilty mind. That is mens rea. Did he have a guilty mind? And then the act itself, actus rea, the act itself was guilty. So was there an awareness on his part? Two of the examples that I try to break down to my students using this in cases that they might be aware of, and these are really over-the-top examples, but just so that we understand, when you go back to a case like, say, for instance, Ed Gein, who was the infamous serial killer from Plainville, Wisconsin, or Plainview, Wisconsin, he did not possess a guilty mind, but the acts were guilty that he committed. Whereas you go to another case out of Wisconsin several years later with Jeffrey Dahmer, he was in possession of both the guilty act and the guilty mind. So therefore, you have what's referred to as concurrence. Those two things, those two components merge together. The question that has to be asked here, relative to Jonchuck, did he possess both of those at the same time? This awareness that he was driving erratically, trying to, beat the cops to the top of the bridge, maybe. There were phone calls that had been placed, apparently. And then to get away, he had an awareness that he had done wrong. In my mind, at least, that's a guilty mind. So it's kind of a simple argument as far as
the defense was saying, who knows what he was running away from? Did he know it was police officers? By the way, Ed Gein, isn't that the guy that wore people's face as a mask?
Yeah, Leatherface.
Oh, right, yeah. Great way to start the morning. Let's keep going on. I want to start off now with Officer William Vickers from the St. Petersburg Police Department. This is a huge witness for the prosecution. This is, I think, the first witness that was called. This is the person who saw Jonchuck throw his daughter off that bridge. Wow. Joseph, I'm still trying to process what that comment is. You have no free will. But the idea of the crime scene here, this bridge, the water, how do you process a crime scene quite like that?
There's really no way, Jesse. All you can do is simply document through photography. And at that point in time, what you cannot capture, we see a daylight image of this location and the ladder that the officer, climbed down. You cannot capture that moment that he's talking about, where he's having to climb down that ladder. He's got gusting winds at over 20 miles per hour. He gets down onto the bumper area, where he actually states that he felt like he was going to be blown off at one point in time. The water it's not just lapping. Think of that sound if you're at the lake or the beach. It's not just a lapping sound. You've actually got probably little whitecaps that are out there. Water swirling. I'm sure his adrenaline is pumping. He's seen this little girl go off. You can't capture that to process it. So that's difficult in and of itself. All you can do is just simply take photos. Now, if she struck an object on the way down and there's some tissue left or a bit of clothing, you can process that and try to, frame the scene relative to that. But other than that, you're left wanting.
It's difficult to imagine this case as we look at Phoebe Jonchuck, knowing what happened to her, listening to the officer who witnessed this. I mean, it's just really hard to even process. And what did you make of the comment, "You have no free will"? What do you make of that statement?
I don't know. It's almost like, he's making some kind of theological comment, like he's, I don't know, some, Calvinist. You have no free will. And that he's made these references to God in the past, and I think the Swedish Bible needed to be translated, and all these other things that came up along the way. I don't know where that comes from. I have no idea whatsoever. But at the end of the day, what did happen was that this fellow pulled over on the side of the bridge. He was given a lawful order to cease and desist from what he was doing. And he took that little girl and he flung her off of the side of the bridge at
Right.
the end of the day. Now, I don't know. Maybe he's saying he didn't have free will in what he was doing, but it's an action. It is an action that he took.
And that's the part that I'm wondering what the jury thought of that, saying, you have no free will, officer, but I sure do. I know what I'm doing, and I'm going to kill my daughter. That's maybe what Jonchuck, was thinking at that moment. Okay, and those messages just basically, in my opinion, showed the deliberate nature of Jonchuck, that he knew what was going on. He was fully compatible, fully coherent, knew what was happening. And, Joseph, when we look at this, we're talking so much about the defendant, his mental health, what was going on. But we can't forget Phoebe Jonchuck, can we? We can't forget what she went through that night, being tossed 62 feet off of a bridge into the water. That's the thing that really just stands out more than anything for me. What about you?
Yeah, let's talk about her frame of mind just for a second. We've talked about his. We've given him enough time. Terror, horror, hopelessness, being not understanding why someone that loves her has treated her this way and has behaved this way, struggling for life, not able to breathe, impacting that bridge on the way down to create that injury. That was her last moments, Jesse, struggling to hold on to life, and we need to keep that in mind. And many times that's what happens in criminal trials. It's all about the defendant, and under our criminal justice system, that's the way it's set up. But this little girl, this precious little life, snuffed out in that moment, and in a very horrific way that none of us can really comprehend. We can try to paint that picture scientifically, what the medical examiner said, but that's not the sole totality of it. It was her mental state at that moment in time, that kind of frames all of this in, and we need to remember that there was an awareness on her part. She lived for a time, Jesse, and I think that that's very important. She had an awareness that she was struggling with life, and in the end, she succumbed.
It's absolutely awful. And my question, Joseph, is could this have been prevented? Could someone have intervened at an earlier time?
Yeah, but I think that as a society, we're very timid to go after aggressively with treatment of mental illness. And we years and years ago, so many, and we hear this coming forward many times. Now we close down mental health facilities, and now people are just kind of cast aside. We've got mental health patients that are roaming the streets that are without help. Many times makes up a huge portion of our homeless population, and that's just what we see on the surface. There's a lot of people that are kind of sitting around in quiet desperation. I think maybe this guy was one of them, but I don't think that there's enough to show that he was listening to some kind of other higher power, if you will, or demonic entity that's telling him what to do. He made a choice at that moment in time when he took that little girl and he threw her off of that bridge. So yeah, maybe it could have been prevented, but it wasn't at the end of the day.
And the jury came back and said that he had a choice. They said that this was a deliberate action. He knew what he was doing. He murdered his daughter. And there's a lot of evidence that you could look throughout this whole trial to point to that. The idea of his motive behind this, the communications he had, things that we heard. There was some communications that the jury didn't hear, but we knew. Especially there was a paralegal who provided a statement that the jury didn't hear about his intention to ultimately kill this young girl, and he will spend the rest of his life in prison. It's just an awful case. We wish we never had to cover it, and we wish we never saw it, but we are trying to understand exactly what happened. I know a lot of the people who testified earlier talk about their final communications with Jonchuck and seeing Phoebe Jonchuck, probably wondering, is there something that could have been done differently? But it's, as you said, it was his decision, his choice, and he's ultimately paying for it. Joseph Scott Morgan, thank you so much for coming on as always. Can't wait to have you back.
Great to be on with you guys. Have a great day.
You too. All right, everybody. Stay tuned here on Law and Crime. We'll be right back.